Welcome back to session 4. As we have been doing, let's start with prayer with the same song. Holy wisdom, lamp of learning, bless the light that reason lends. Teach us judgment as we kindle sparks of thought your Spirit sends. Sanctify our search for knowledge and the truth that sets us free. Come illumine mind and spirit, joined in deepest unity. Vine of truth, in you we flourish, by your grace we learn and grow. May the word of Christ among us shape our life, our search to know. Joined to Christ in living, dying, may we help the church convey witness to the saving gospel, bearing fruit of faith today. We're now at the fourth and final session. Just want to remind you that at the very beginning of the first session, I said I deliberately called this a seminar because I don't have all the answers that we might be looking for. And I'm going to rely on the wisdom of the groups people who are here assembled. And I think more than any of the other sessions, this one depends upon your wisdom. So I'm counting on you to get me through this. There will be some content, but a good deal of this, at least the first part, is going to be a little quick review, very quick, and then we'll introduce a little more things for our consideration. So again, the first thing that we will do tonight is review some of the terms and information from the first few sessions. Then I'm going to offer 3 stories or examples for us to think about that hopefully will help make sense of what the review was talking about. Then I will introduce what I have identified as some obstacles to seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth. There will be more, I'm sure, that you can come up with. Then we'll have some small group conversation. Then I'm going to identify what I think are going to be helps in attending to and dealing with, looks like I forgot to put something in. Oh no, help to dealing with the obstacles. Then some more small group conversation. And then closing prayer. I want to let you know that I am going to have 2 handouts for you tonight that will give you a hard copy of the things you're going to see on the screen tonight. So you don't have to feel, certainly you're free to write if you want, but we're going to go through what's on the screen before I pass the handouts out. Okay? So you may remember in session 2, we talked about why it's important to identify different kinds of truth. And I told you that I brainstormed all of these different kinds of truth. I'm not going to define them tonight, but just to remind you what I identified. Mathematical truth, logical truth, objective, subjective truth, absolute, relative, scientific, laws of nature, symbolic, narrative, mythic, historical, artistic, ethical, metaphysical, religious, ritual, legal, judicial, criminal, autobiographical, introspective, interpersonal, relational, emotional, oratorical, rhetorical, journalistic, and advertising. Remember all that? Yeah. Okay. If I call any of you to define any of these, would you be ready to do that? Then, we've looked at this a few times, factors involved in interpreting the truth. Biology. Okay, these come from Robert Cummings Neville. We talked about how the biological beings that we are make a significant difference how we engage the real and how we interpret the real. Then there is culture, culture kind of shapes our perspective and begins to call our attention to certain things that our biology perceives unconsciously even, then a subset of culture are the sign systems in which we dwell. And then not least, the purposive intents, the reasons we come to engage what we engage and interpret what and how we interpret. So all of those are fundamental backgrounds and what can we call it? Factors involved in how we interpret truth. Then last week, I think it was last week, I talked about how there are, in our contemporary culture, there are things that work to shape also what we choose to pay attention to, how we choose to pay attention to it. Our biology engages all these things, etc. So I identified these things. We're in a digital age, and we know that in our culture there's a digital divide. Some people have access to digital media and others don't. Globalization and resistances to globalization, which if we pay the least bit of attention to the news, we know that that's happening right now. Secularization, religious pluralism. We are exposed to a variety of religions that when most of us were children were completely foreign to us. Or not only foreign, but we were unaware of them. Fundamentalism, somebody asked me what I mean by fundamentalism. I mean fundamentalism that's excessive literalism. Okay, that's what I mean by fundamentalism. You could say fundamentalism means paying attention to fundamentals, but I'm meaning excessive literalism like you might see in evangelical fundamentalism. Scientific worldviews, the new atheism, and by the new atheism I mean that there are people who are actively promoting atheism, okay, and they have their own set of reasons for doing that. Consumerism, ethnicities, class differences, individualism, feminism, and we could add other isms to that, diversity, change as a constant, and more. And I guess we can say my hypothesis is this, that as we seek and discover and interpret and articulate and try to abide in truth, there is a kind of convergence of these things. The different kinds of truth makes a difference to what we pick up in the middle column, and cultural determinants from the other direction influence what we seek, what we discover, how we interpret, etc. So we're going to see that there's interaction, they bounce off one another, and I'm going to offer some examples now of how I think we can understand this. So as you know, I subscribe to Scientific American, and in the recent issue, there was an advertisement for something called the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And it was on the side here, and it was called In Science We Trust. Okay, and then the text underneath, where there's a picture that says Save Our Planet, and then it says Christian nationalist rejection of climate change endangers our future. The only afterlife that should concern us is leaving our descendants and planet a secure and pleasant future. Join the nation's largest association of non-believers working to keep religion out of government. Then I went to their website and said, what is the freedom from religion's purpose? And this is what I found. The history of Western civilization shows us that most social and moral progress has been brought about by persons free from religion. In modern times, the first to speak out for prison reform, for humane treatment of the mentally ill, for abolition of capital punishment, for women's right to vote, for death with dignity for the terminally ill, and for the right to choose contraception, sterilization, and abortion have been free thinkers, just as they were the first to call for an end to slavery. The Freedom from Religion Foundation works as an umbrella for those who are free from religion and are committed to the cherished principle of separation of state and church. As Freedom from Religion's principal founder, Ann Gaylor, noted, to be free from religion is an advantage for individuals. It is a necessity for government. So if you go to the handout that I just gave you, we can see how there are things at play here. So there are some kinds of truth that are being appealed to in this, not the least of which is scientific truth, historical truth. There's probably in there some, they would say, logical truth. There's certainly some oratorical truth going on and rhetorical truth. But you can see how those different kinds of truth interact to form a foundation for what the Freedom from Religion Foundation claims they are. And then if you look to the column on the right, we can see there that there is secularization that is present there, the new atheism, again, scientific worldviews, change is a constant. Those things interact to help explain and understand why the Freedom from Religion Foundation understands itself the way it does. Go to the middle column, again, this is the case in every attempt to interpret and articulate the truth. The biology of the people involved has to do with what they become conscious of, and the cultural and symbolic and the purposes involved shape their understanding of truth and what's important truth and what's trivial. What's important truth to be grasped and what's important truth to let go of. Okay? And you can see that for people who give emphasis to different kinds of things on this sheet of paper, they might come up with different conclusions. The second example I owe to Cal, who made me aware of this book, called Imbeciles, or depending on your pronunciation, Imbeciles. Okay? And I have to say that every once in a while I read something and I say, why didn't I know that? I'm a very highly educated person, and I was completely oblivious to the things this book is talking about. You may remember in a homily a while back, I talked about a book called 272, which had to do with Jesuit ownership of slaves prior to and during the Civil War. That was another one of those books that I said, how did I not know this? How could I be oblivious to these truths? So I'm just going to read the back blurb of this text. In 1927, the Supreme Court, 1927, that's 100 years ago practically, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling so disturbing, ignorant, and cruel that it stands as one of the great injustices in American history. In Imbeciles, best-selling author Adam Cohen exposes the court's decision to allow the sterilization of a young woman, Carrie Buck, it wrongly thought to be, quote, feeble-minded, and to champion the mass eugenic sterilization of undesirable citizens. The 8-1 Supreme Court ruling was signed by many revered figures in American law, including Chief Justice William Howard Taft, a former president, and Louis Brandeis, a progressive icon. Oliver Wendell Holmes, considered by many to be the greatest Supreme Court justice in history, wrote the majority opinion, declaring, and I quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, unquote. The woman who was featured in this book, Carrie Buck, when they were trying to make the case against her, they said that her mother was an imbecile and her child was an imbecile. At the time they made that claim, the child was 2 or 3 months old.
Wow.
They had no way of knowing what the mental status was. But they kind of trumped up the case, and in this shocking story, Cohen overturns cherished myths and demolishes lauded figures in relentless pursuit of the truth. So again, if you look at your handout, you can see some of the factors that might have shaped the conclusions that the people championing eugenics came to. The idea was this: we have undesirables in our society, the feeble-minded, morons, epileptics, etc. And the best way to deal with those maladies in society is to prevent people who have them from procreating, because the conviction was that all these are genetically passed on diseases. So if we can, over time, just stop the procreation, then we won't have to worry about these. Okay, so take a look at what's on this sheet of paper, and you can pick up ethnicities, class differences, diversity, globalization and its resistance, in some kinds of truth. Well, obviously legal, judicial, criminal, autobiographical and introspective, narrative, certainly. You can see how these different kinds of truth and cultural context come together to shape what people are noticing and the convictions they come to. And again, the middle column is involved in all of this. So it's an easy read in terms of the kind of writing. It's a hard read in terms of the content. This happened before the Second World War. It happened before what Hitler did with Jews and others in Europe. It's part of our history. I had no idea. And the fact that I had no idea, I consider that to be an obstacle to my understanding of the truth. An obstacle to how I understand the rest of American and world history. An obstacle to my self-understanding as a United States citizen. Okay? Here's the last one's a little lighter. This past Saturday, at the 4 o'clock Mass, I was sitting in my presider's chair, and after the first reading, the psalm refrain began to be sung. I looked across the church at one of the church windows closest to where Melissa is, and the lower window had been wide open. And as I looked across the church, I said to myself, I think there's a bird on the other side of this sill looking in. And what really got my attention was that the bird didn't move a feather. It was like the bird was listening to the song refrain. And I was far enough away that I couldn't tell what kind of bird it was. But how often do you see a bird perfectly still during a psalm refrain? So then I said, well, I'll see what's going to happen once the second reading starts. Maybe the bird wants to fly in. But that bird remained absolutely motionless. And I'm looking and still trying to figure out, what kind of bird is this? Finally, when the second reading was done and the gospel acclamation was played, I got to walk to where the altar is and get a closer view, at which point I noticed that this was a hand sanitizer dispenser. But I got to tell you, up until that moment, I was convinced I was having a religious experience. That God was sending some kind of a sign to say, something marvelous is going on here. You know? And I was already beginning to process, what does this mean? And I was beginning to interpret the significance of this event. And obviously my biology was kicking in. And the things that I have been attending to with respect to birds, I know my sister takes care of birds, and my friend Sharon and Lori likes birds, and I learned more about birds in the last year or two than I had the rest of my life, but the fact of the matter is, I was convinced there was a bird sitting on that shelf, and I thought God was telling me something. So again, if you look at the kinds of truth, I guess you could say laws of nature were involved there. I'm thinking, I've never seen a bird do this before. I didn't realize birds do this. There certainly was something symbolic. I mean, the Holy Spirit is symbolized as a bird. There was something, I guess you could say something artistic and metaphysical, religious. It was, at one and the same time, it was very, very powerful. And when I saw what it was very, very disconcerting. But it was also one of those things that I said, I got to share this with the group on Tuesday, because I think it gets to seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in religion, in truth. Okay? So do you see how these things come into play as we're seeking and doing all of this? So I thank God. I'll give God some credit for that religious, quasi-religious experience. And I thank Melissa for opening the window. Okay, now, what are some obstacles to seeking and all those other things we're talking about with respect to truth? These are obstacles that I have identified myself. There may be more, and you may be asked in a little bit to see if you can identify with more. One is indifference. If it's true or not, I don't care. Okay? Why should I seek anything deeper or more meaningful than what I'm experiencing? Related to this is complacency. I already know the truths I need to know. So, why need to seek more? Ignorance. I don't know what I don't know. So I don't know what I should be looking for or seeking. Laziness. I'm tired of all this. Okay? Being overwhelmed. People have reported to me in the course of this series, this seminar, that the things we've talked about and the complexity with which we talk about them is just absolutely overwhelming. And so, I'll throw up my hands and say, there's more here than I can handle, so why should I look for anything? Lack of discipline. What do I want to say about this? Because the subject matter is so complicated, and because there are so many things involved, it really does take discipline to follow the chain of evidence in the right order and with the right sense of importance of the evidence, and to stay with it, because it would be easy to give up the search and the interpretation. Fear. What am I going to find? I'm afraid it's going to challenge what I already believe to be true. And where's that going to leave me? On the other hand, hubris. I already know all that I need to know. And if you want to know, just ask me. I'll be happy to tell you. Ideology, we've talked about that before. How it's not just an attempt to describe what society is, but to prescribe what it ought to be. Okay? And that can be an obstacle to seeking truth. Blindness. I just don't see. It's not that I just don't know. I don't even see. And fantasy. It's more comfortable to live in a world of my own making, my own fantasy. Now, remember, the neuroscientists tell us that our worlds are our own construction, the biology and everything else that factors in. By fantasy here, I'm thinking of things like online avatars, You know, I'm thinking of conspiracy theories. I'm thinking of people who live in different worlds, you know, a fantasy reality. So those are some obstacles that I have identified to seeking truth. And so now, obstacles to discovering and interpreting the truth. Again, this is my list. Certainly lies. Okay, we talked about that in some detail in the very first session. Disinformation and misinformation. Remember we said disinformation was deliberate circulation of information that wasn't true, with an awareness on the part of the person who is disseminating it. Misinformation is something that's passed on by somebody who passes it on without realizing it's disinformation. You see how that gets in the way of discovering and interpreting the truth? Too much information. Again, there's so much here that I can't possibly process it and bring order out of it, make sense of it. Predispositions. Let's go to my bird example. I was predisposed to have a religious experience as I was sitting in the chair watching this perfectly still bird, right? And that got in the way of me seeing across the church, in addition to my glasses, it got in the way of me seeing that this was a container of hand sanitizer. That's probably a kind of inane example, but certainly the predispositions that we bring into any experience help to shape what we see or don't see, and that those predispositions can have to do with previous experiences as well. I'm calling this media tunnel vision. We're all familiar with this. We talked about it the first week. We get locked into something on our phones or on our computers, the algorithms kick in, and we're fed to the same media outlets over and over and over again, so we only see what this media stream shows. That's an obstacle to interpreting and discovering truth, because there's a whole other set of media that's offering something else that we're not engaging. A lack of competence. I'm talking specifically of symbolic competence. Over the years, I just not have cultivated enough an idea of how to recognize symbols, how to understand symbols, how to interpret symbols, and over time and with effort and discipline, I can get better at that. Think of it a little bit like developing a sense of artistic sensitivity. I took a course in music theory when I was a freshman at John Carroll, and one of the things I had to do was take a test to listen to 20 pieces of music, to identify the period, the representative composer, instrumentation, the kind of piece it was. By the end of that course, I knew more about hearing music than I knew before I entered the course. There was a kind of symbolic competence that was developed there, and that can happen with all forms of art, I think. Developmental level. So am I, to oversimplify, am I a grade school or a high schooler, a college level person? Am I an adult who is mature or an adult who is immature? The developmental level that I bring to discovering and interpreting truth makes a difference to what I discover and how I interpret it. Error. I made a mistake. It was hand sanitizer. Personal agenda. I have an interest in wanting this to be what it is. And so I'm bringing my personal agenda into the seeking for the truth. And obviously, some of these things overlap and are redundant. I mentioned previous experience already. And ironically, we might have too much information to make sense of things. But if we don't know what we don't know, maybe it's because we lack access to what it is we don't know. So that can be an obstacle to discovering and interpreting truth. Okay? Makes sense?
Yes.
All right, so small group conversations. curious to ask the wisdom of the group. Are there other obstacles that you discovered or mentioned? Yes.
Willful blindness.
Willful blindness.
There's a book on that. I'll get you the title.
How about fatigue?
Fatigue?
We're tired of just all this stuff going on. It's so easy to just say, I'm not going to read the paper. I'm not going to do anything else. So I guess it's fatigue.
Willful blindness and fatigue. Stubbornness. Yes.
Well, this probably is a combination of a few of these, but we were talking about how just your own personal experience is so limiting. Like, for instance, because I studied law, I had heard of that Supreme Court case, but you were in a different discipline, so you hadn't heard of it. So we're narrowed, and you know, like I'm the same way when it comes to theology, I'm like clueless. So I think we're narrowed by the experiences, the learnings, the schools we go to, the curriculum we are exposed to, and you know, we don't even know that we don't know.
Right, I agree. Well, thank you. Let's move on. This next presentation piece is going to be relatively brief. So what you got them on your handout. Again, these are things that I brainstormed, and there may be others. What are some helps in attending to or dealing with obstacles to seeking, discovering, interpreting, articulating, and abiding in truth? Curiosity. If I hadn't seen that bird, if I wasn't curious about it, I would never have discovered that I was wrong about the truth. Right? So curiosity seems to me to be a good impetus to moving in the direction of living in the truth. Humility. I suppose this goes along with it, you know. If we're not able to say, I don't know everything there is to know, if I'm not willing to admit error, if I'm not willing to admit that somebody else might know more about this than I do, then that becomes a kind of obstacle. Critical thinking. I guess by critical thinking, I mean not just accepting everything that you hear, but bringing a perspective that tries to evaluate and look at it from different points of view, willingness to make adjustments into what people are saying or what you think they're saying. So engaging critically with what it is that you're bumping into. Conversation with other seekers. This kind of thing here tonight. I think that's really, really important if we're going to seek and discover and interpret truth together. It can't just be a solitary enterprise. It's got to be something that engages other people who are equally invested in seeking and discovering truth, not in covering it up, not in spinning it, but in getting to what is really real, what is really true. A wide spectrum of truth seekers. What do I mean by this? Robert Cummings Neville wrote a book called On the Scope and Truth of Theology. And he says in that book that theology cannot just be done with theologians. Theology has to engage scientists, has to engage philosophers, has to engage people who are engaged in the humanities and the arts, because, as Sharon was just saying, each of us comes to these religious and theological convictions with different backgrounds and different perspectives. And if the conversations over time are going to yield a deeper insight into truth, then there needs to be a wide array of conversation partners. Not just people who think the same, but people who can mutually illuminate and challenge one another. That's not easy. It's not easy. one of the reasons why I like Scientific American, because it often opens my eyes to things that I had not been thinking about before. Debate. This is tricky. Okay. Debate means that people aren't always going to agree with one another, but they're willing to go back and forth with one another to try to come to greater mutual understanding. Okay? And debate is going to mean sometimes I'm going to have to cede some ground, or sometimes somebody else's. Debate is really difficult in a polarized society, right? Because in order to debate, you have to listen, right? And you have to be willing to respect the person you're debating with. And yet, I think debate is helpful in seeking and discovering truth. Cultivating competence. I already mentioned the example of my music appreciation class in my freshman year at John Carroll. The same thing happens. With art objects or art experiences. When I was in DC, I went often to the Smithsonian museums, and the few years I was there, I developed a greater appreciation and sensitivity to the wide variety of art forms, etc. And that is just something that doesn't happen overnight. It's something that you have to immerse yourself in over and over again and allow yourself to be educated. Institutional measures. On the very first night, we talked about Stephen Burrell's book, The Death of Truth. And he identifies institutional realities that make it difficult to know the truth. He talks a lot about disinformation, misinformation. Remember we talked about advertising, that the advertisers don't even know where they're advertising because it's all done algorithmically. Okay. So in the last chapter of his book, he dedicates that to suggesting things that can be done to change laws and social structures in order to mitigate the misinformation, disinformation, and all those things. So that would be also a help in dealing with obstacles. And courage. We have lots of examples that in today that for people to seek and admit truth, especially when it doesn't match that of another, it takes courage. It takes courage. We hear all the time in the news now that people keep their mouths shut because they don't want to face recrimination or they don't want to be primaried, you know. So these are the helps that I identified in dealing with obstacles. Remember, the point of all this is we want to be able to seek, discover, interpret, articulate, and abide in truth. Okay? I'm sure there are more helps than I've identified, but these are what I have provided for you. So now let's take a look at some more small group conversation. Two parts to this. I'm just going to give you the first part first. What would be, based on all of this, what would be some practical recommendations that you might make for dealing with obstacles to seeking, discovering, interpreting? I gave you some examples of theoretically how that might be done. Maybe there are some practical things that you can recommend for dealing with obstacles to seeking and discovering and interpreting. So just take a few minutes to talk about that, then I'll give you a second question. That another help to overcoming obstacles to truth is a sense of humor. I was scrolling through my phone earlier this morning and I saw a story that said the Browns have traded Deshaun Watson to the Atlanta Falcons for Kirk Cousins, and they're going to eat the remaining cost of Deshaun Watson's contract. I said, I haven't heard that story before. And I went and I explored and couldn't find it anywhere else. And then I realized this was April Fool. So you need a sense of humor.
Controversial figure, but he's an injured figure.
Okay, now here's the second question I'd like to ask you to think about and talk about. what is your reaction to tonight's conversation, but to the overall series? What was helpful? What did you learn? What would you like to have heard more of? Just talk about that amongst yourselves. My own reaction to the series has been that you folks have been really gamers. This was not easy content a lot of times, and you kept coming back. And that was true, you kept coming back. I mentioned at the beginning of the series that part of this was, for me, ministerial on behalf of you, but part of it was personal journey for me. Just trying to figure out what's involved in all of this. And I got to say, of the seminars that I have done, or the presentations, the series that I've done, this was probably the hardest one I've done here. So for that reason, I'm glad this is number 4. But it was worth the effort for me. And I trust that for you, it was also worth the effort. At least there was some benefit to what happened. I'm really grateful to you for hanging in and keeping coming back. So please stand for our closing prayer. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts. Let peace fill our world. Let peace fill our universe. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts. Let peace fill our world. Let peace fill